Uh, Welcome everyone to the ULT San Diego Aquarian series. And this week, our theme for reflection and consideration is the topic of fire, very simply, fire. And it's been said that the ones that are only one word are the hardest ones to do. So we asked somebody we feel is very, very capable, Dr. Gene Jennings, to give a presentation on fire. And we had a brief conversation a few days ago, and I can tell he just went to town on the subject. The quote for the week is, "Self-purification through the use of mental fire is the central mode of human evolution, both over the past 18 million years and on into the future of humanity." And we'll see that the quote for today from Bhavani Shankar is, "In the Chidangakunda, the heart, dwells the divine fire." And from Rifai, "The body is not to be put off, it is to be refined and made spiritual, a help and not a hindrance to the spirit. It is like a metal that has to be refined by fire and transmuted." So I am going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Gene Jennings.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Jonathan. Okay, let's just really take a look at this topic of fire. As Jonathan and I were discussing it a few days ago, we were thinking about, or he actually asked if we should tailor the title and make it a little bit more defined so that we could talk about a particular aspect of fire. And that sounded good because it would be easier. We could talk about spiritual fire. We could talk about, garden variety fire. But in terms of the teachings, that really would not be justifiable. So we kind of took a zooming out look on how fire is represented in the Theosophical teachings. So the title, which is no title, is just kind of taking an imaginary walk through the Garden of Fire. And definitely the disclaimer at the bottom: nothing we say today can be true. And there's a reason why. That has to be the truth. Sure. Okay, here we go. To start off with the basics, when we talk about fire, it's typically something that everyone is familiar with. And in the world of science today, it's simply defined without defining it as containing three essential components: fuel, oxygen, and heat. And that is the symbolic threefold method of identifying the reaction that occurs when heat becomes sufficient to ignite the fuel at a particular temperature, whereby oxygen can interact and create this thing that we call fire and flame. And it's an interesting thought that they began with their first definition using a threefold aspect, because that agrees, interestingly enough, as we'll try to bring out later on, with that threefold aspect of the Logos. And yet, recently, I don't know how recent, but they've come up with the idea of the fourfold aspect, the tetrahedron. And this is four elements that are contained in the total reaction that, again, manifests as the idea of fire, flame, and heat. And again, we've got fuel, we've got heat, we've got oxygen, and the fourth component being the chemical reaction amongst them all. Now, 3 and 4 to me, and probably to everyone else in the Theosophical world, really rings a bell, but not so much from the perspective of science. But that threefold aspect of fire, which they speak about in the science books as one side of a triangle, or the triangle as one side of the pyramid, and then those other 3 components as 3 additional sides of the pyramid, create that pyramid that becomes manifested, that we again identify as fire. So when we're in school, these are the elements, these are the chemicals that we've got to deal with in terms of the oxygen, what makes up the heat in terms of the friction, and the fuel and its chemical components, and how all of that comes together to create fire. From the symbolical view, we wanted to just bring out the idea that fire is kind of a universal symbol without much explanation that has been used throughout time. And these particular comments, and we can just scroll through them without really explaining them because they're out of context, but they all come from the SD, the Secret Doctrine, and from Isis Unveiled. And HPB's point in identifying these was to show that fire, again, was a universal principle that was adopted by all elements of humanity to represent something. But as you scroll through this list, and it's 2 additional slides just to give you a purview, you will see, if you try to understand the nature of the fire that is being referenced, that it's a little vague. And so, although we can put them in general context according to culture, according to time, we don't really come to an understanding of meaning. And that's similar even if we think back to the slide on the chemistry of fire, heat, fuel, and oxygen, and the chemical reaction. We have elements, but we really don't have understanding of what those elements are. And so HPB speaks about the burning torch of Apollo. She speaks about the fire flame of Pluto's helm. She speaks about the staff that should be of Mercury. She takes us through the burning bush of Moses, the Pentecostal fire tongues, the sidereal light of the Rosicrucians, the eternal fire of the bottomless pit, the ode of Reichenbach, the galvanism and the electricity. She brings up the ideas that have been expressed in the West. The Lord is a consuming fire. She speaks about the Zoroastrian sacred fire, the Hermes fire, the Elms fire of the Germans, the lightning of Cybele, the psychoid and eutectic force of Thurii, and the vital fire and fire of life. And yet, with all of these different kinds of fire, we still don't have a real sense of what fire is. And perhaps there's a reason for that. This is my favorite quote. And it was presented by one of the teachers for consideration and is from the Parinirvana Sutra, Quen 39. And it reads, "The permanent never merges with the impermanent, although the two are one. It is only when all outward appearances are gone that there is left that one principle of life, which exists independently of all external phenomena. It is the fire that burns in the eternal light. when the fuel is expended and the flame is extinguished. For that fire is neither in the flame nor in the fuel, nor yet inside of the two, but above, beneath, and everywhere. Now, on the first reading, perhaps this doesn't make sense as a definition. But the more you ponder it, the more you read it, the more you begin to understand it. Several things stand out that, independent of appearance, when all appearances are gone, independent of any external phenomena, when the very fuel is expended, meaning if we look at the chemical definition, the very elements are gone. And the flame that is a representation of the fire that is within is extinguished. Then we come close to a definition and a realization of what true fire is. And that fire, as it says, is neither in the flame nor in the fuel nor inside of the tube, but in essence, everywhere. And that is a wonderful definition of what we are told is metaphysically and esoterically the one element in nature. And we have to be careful because the one element in nature is not necessarily the deific principle outside of nature. And we might think about Mula Prakriti in that respect, or we might think about Aditi or Akasha, depending upon what we're trying to understand. But it is the one element in nature, and at the root of it is the deity. So even here, we're looking at an element and yet something that transcends that element, that is more the truth of fire. And it goes on to say that the so-called 7 elements, of which 5 have already manifested and asserted their existence, are the garment, the veil of that deity. And we have to caution that although we accept the term deity as that primal cause, just to mention the word deity means that we've missed the boat. And so we have to ask, what does the esoteric teaching say in regards to fire? It says that fire is the most perfect and unadulterated reflection, a reflection in heaven as on earth of the one flame. It is life and death, the origin and the end of every material thing. It is divine substance. And so here we're talking about fire as something that is different than a simple flame that burns or consumes. We're talking about fire and identifying it with the very heart of life itself, and through its motion somehow manifest an aspect of itself which is called divine substance. And it is through that substance that the combination of, if we reflect on the secret doctrine, the great breath that arouses the hidden fire within its own nature, can manifest such substance that then becomes all things and every material thing. And so now we're looking at fire as a trans-universal, trans-cosmical, definitely transpersonal element that, again, exists even prior to the manifestation of the substance that will eventually give rise to all of the forms in life that we know. And so when we look, light is cold flame, and flame is fire. And the fire produces heat, which yields water, the water of life in the Great Mother. And HPB calls that Great Mother chaos. And if we think and reflect on these last couple of slides, what we really have is the beginning of a process that is hidden, so to speak, behind the words that allows us to understand how that one element, which is superior to the 49 principles and 49 fires that we typically speak of, how that one element can self-generate itself, can self-manifest itself, can self-animate itself, can self-destruct itself, and self-create itself. And so the real question is, how does that even happen? And we are further told that fire, when we really want to understand its breadth and its application in nature, stands in every philosophical and religious system as a, again, representation, or if we remember the earlier slide, a reflection of the spirit of deity. And we should put that word, again, deity in quotes, because deity depends upon the depth of one's vision in regards to examining the nature that is hidden regarding fire. It is the active male generative principle and ether, or the soul of matter, the light of the fire, for the passive principle from which everything in the universe emanated. Hence, ether or water is the mother, and father is the fire. And so when we're talking about mother and father as divided factors, clearly then we're talking about another stage wherein a different aspect of this one element that gives rise to and is fire, a cold hidden fire, as described in the stanzas, becomes the animating generative force and the very substance that it acts in, or fire and water. We see this in the stanzas, and stanza 3 starts off with, the root of life was in every drop of the ocean of immortality, and the ocean was radiant light, which was fire and heat and motion. And so we're taken back to that Trinity that reflects the ideas of the three logi, or we're taken back to that Trinity that reflects the fire that exists in the absolute, that manifests itself, if we can speak in heretical terms, as Parabrahm, and subsequently as Mula Prakriti. Or we can push back that triad of fire in its own way as representative of the absoluteness, its law, and the great breath that is inherent within it. No matter how far we push, we will always find the elements that arise from the one element that, when they are animated and in process acting, create the very thing that is latent and hidden within it, which is that fire. And fire creates heat, yet heat gives rise to fire. Fire creates motion, yet motion gives rise to fire. So again, we're looking at a triad of things that feed each other and are each other. And again, this was just my error, same slide, on the screen of flame. Now, when we talk about fire, because we haven't applied any of this yet, we have to recognize some of the properties, at least in the secret doctrine and other areas of the teaching in Isis, that are ascribed to this fire. And so, again, if we take it to, relatively speaking, the early beginnings, we're speaking about a latent, hidden fire that is identified with deity. It is a cold fire, but not an extinguished fire. It has frictional properties, again, when that great breath begins moving within its own self, within its own nature. There is something in it that is akin to friction that creates that heat that eventually results in germinal fire. And we say germinal fire because the flame and the fire as a manifestation has not yet occurred. And all of these are properties and stages or phases of the activity of, if we would like to call it simply, the one great breath acting in and upon itself, which holds within itself all of these properties due to the different variations of motion or pulsation or oscillation, or HPB says vertical motion. All different, giving rise to, in some Hindu texts, the different tapas that stand at the very beginning of the manifestation of the universe itself. So again, we have to acknowledge in this whole process of fire, that motion, that fire, that heat, that generates its own substance, which is, as HPB says in the Secret Doctrine, always present and always eternal as the latent hidden fire that exists secondarily in its pre-cosmic state and phases. And we can see that obviously through the motions of the first logos, the second logos, and the third logos before the actual manifestation of the germ of the universe. And then subsequently in its germinal state within that Brahmanic circumference wherein the light finally begins to glimmer because essence has taken on the nature of substance, and substance has within it inherently properties. And those properties then create the radiant fire, the expulsion, the centrifugal force. The centrifugal force going outwards that creates within the circumference of the designated frame of existence the very stuff that the universe, as we come to understand it, will be made of. And all of that, she says, is flame, is light, is heat, is motion, is vibration, is electricity, is magnetism, it is sound. All of the forces that are spoken of in the Secret Doctrine, the Parasakti, the Janasakti, the Ichasakti, the Kritya Sakti, the Mantra Sakti, all synthetically embraced in that one force, which if we get towards the end, we'll see how T. Subarao expresses that on a lower level of cosmic existence. And fire also has what we simply call the hibernative property. That tends to differ from preservation in regards to preservation maintaining even during activity. That hibernative capacity is heat within itself, maintaining stability, yet appearing as inactive from the outside. The preservation is a constant coming, going, building, destructive process that maintains a degree of equilibrium. The creativity of fire is in its motions and its intensities in regards to what it will allow to grow from its own substance, what it will destroy, again, what it will maintain, or what it will constantly regenerate. And so when we're speaking of fire, we also have to acknowledge the properties, dynamic in themselves, that one fire gives rise to. And so eventually we're going to show a chart that everybody already knows about, but when we begin to think about even these properties, when we put them into the chart, we're looking at the 49 aspects of these properties as they relate to aspects of substance, again, all in one and the same thing at different phases of existence, yet interacting with each other to create a whole manifold appearance of life in which every drop has latent fire within it. Let me just backtrack for a moment, because quickly to walk you through, that was just the scientific slide. This was the slide, and it was 3 slides of descriptions that HPB had put out in regards to how fire is represented in all kinds of different traditions, in all times, in all different cultures. And then this was the one quote that I just said I preferred, I really, really liked, in terms of the permanent never merging with the impermanent, and all outward appearances, when they are consumed and the one principle is left independent of any external phenomena, then we are approaching that truth that we can call fire. And it is above, beneath, and everywhere. That was from the Parinirvana Sutra. And then we simply moved to a few other explanatory slides in regards to what fire was. And then we got down to the quote from stanza 3. And that was the quote indicating that the fire that is everywhere that we referred to earlier was really the root of life that was in every drop of the ocean of immortality, Amrita. And the ocean was radiant light, which was fire and heat and motion. And so from those characteristics, we then moved down to looking at certain properties that we had found were within the teachings themselves, i.e. the secret doctrine, as to light, which was the reflection of fire. And again, making a distinction between the hidden fire that is undiscoverable as such, and the expression of that fire, which when present generates from fire, flame, light, heat, motions, vibrations, electricity, magnetism, sound, and we mentioned those 6 forces of Tisa Burrell when he speaks about the Saktis. And he will get to that article in a bit in terms of the zodiac, wherein he explains certain aspects of that. But all of these forces then, when, as we said, we place them on that chart of 49 fires, which is simply the principles, the 7 principles divided into their sub-principle categories. Then we're looking at different aspects of this fire. And so when we begin to be more familiar with those principles, we can apply those principles to the nature of fire if we understand where we are, where we're applying them. And so the point that we got up to was the point having to do with the theosophical keys. And so if you reflect back on that first slide, the first 3 slides where we were talking about HPB giving renditions of how fire was represented in all of these different cultures, and yet we couldn't really say anything about them. Using the keys of theosophy in relationship to fire, we come to an understanding of several things. First, if you look at the bullet points, you'll see that we're moving, again, SD, cosmological, and within that cosmological framework, HPB in the stanzas speaks about fire in many, many different ways, applications on different levels, and having different properties. And so that cosmological category or key opens us to the logoic expression, and she, in a beautiful passage, speaks about the three logi, each of those having 7 rays and 7 fires. And so those become the 21 fires in conjunction with the 3 sources from which they came, which made 24 fires, each of different characteristics and properties, which then, when they are doubled because of the subjective and objective aspects of their nature, or the positive and negative aspects of their nature, become 48, all consumed in the synthetic nature of that one logo. And so she explained fire from the 49 aspects of the logoic view. She talks about fire from the central spiritual sun as the heart of the entire universe. Again, logoic in nature, in its inner, and because it's manifest, a step down, different degrees of substance, having moved past the Laya point, now having different characteristics, but these same forces emanating their own fires and moving through life, then to the Brahmanic stage. And here we're not talking about just the names, but looking at these as literal stages of development and unfolding that fire produces. And so the Brahmanic stage, the germination stage, the awakening of its own 7-fold aspects of Dhyani Chohan's in conjunction with Fohatic life and electricity and its 7-fold aspects or fires. Fires, again, animating, lighting up, giving vital life to whatever principle it's in. When we think about fire, if we, as the alchemists say, regulate it carefully, we can allow things to grow, we can nurture things, we can mature things. Or if it's not regulated, we can destroy things. Or if it's not enough, they will never develop. So the science of fire in its 49 loose ways on the different planes in regards to the different principles become a science that is spoken about throughout the secret doctrine if one applies the information that HPB has provided to us. We can then take the same fires and apply them anthropologically or ethnologically, as in Book 2. And all of you that have been through those works know that she speaks about the solar fires, she speaks about the lunar fires, she speaks about the solar pitris, the lunar pitris, she speaks about the cosmic fires, she speaks about the Manuic or the Manasic fires. The higher fire is not having, as she said, an astral aura, so not being able to manifest. Yet the lower fires of the Kumaras having such an aura such that they could then link up with the comic aspect of fire in order to bring fire to earth in that myth of Prometheus, etc. So again, a myth, a science, information, a force, properties, and because fire has, again, as we said, one of the properties is light illumination. One of the interpretations of that light and illumination, she tells us in the SD, is the highest stage of esoteric wisdom awoken. And so we can talk about states of consciousness that illuminate us to cosmological truths, states of consciousness that illuminate us to ethnological or anthropomorphic truths, or we can talk about states of consciousness that awaken us to the next is astronomical. And in the astronomical, she gives us that sevenfold, what can we call it? Quasi-equation, where from homogeneity, which is again hidden latent light, the nebula moves to the gaseous and aeriform radiant phase, and then it moves to the Kurd phase, accumulating matter on top of those sparks, and then it moves to the atomic etheric and germinal phase, and then it moves to the atomic fiery stage. Why? Because now those particles, she says, in motion create a different kind of astronomical friction that creates a flame of fire and heat and light and motion. And from there, it moves to the watery phase as the fires begin to cool the airs by distance, separation, and water falls, and finally the cold independent stage where that whole process results in the generation of earth that she calls cold independent upon the sun. And so we've got, again, the solar fires, the lunar fires, because we know what the relationship is of the moon to the earth, and we've got the earth fires. Geologically, we've got the fires, as we see, that relate to the rotation of the earth. We've got the fires that relate to the tilting of the earth, the poles, the equator, the ecliptics, the solstice, the equinox, and the fires that are latent within the very elements of the earth that have been gathered during that nebulic period and condensed into this coal-independent entity upon which subsequent life forms arise. We can talk about the theosophical psychological keys as they relate to the fires of our being. HPB tells us about that Kundalini fire in the Voice of the Silence and the centers that are related to those, the three aspects of those, the Ida, the Pingala, and the Sushumna. And although she doesn't talk about how they relate, clearly she makes reference to the friction that has to be developed in order to awaken the fire, and what that fire awakens in terms of, again, light, heat, development, nurturing, sustenance, illumination, states of consciousness, etc. She speaks about the fire from the mystical point of view, and she defines mysticism as a veil that prevents the mystic themselves from seeing the truth. Whereas from the occult and esoteric perspective of dealing with the fires, that is about knowledge, that is about experiential encounter, that is about recognizing how these fires relate to the very monadic essence itself, the intellectual aspect of the monastic being, the lunar aspect of the physical being, how they integrate, how they preserve principles intact, and how they destroy principles intact, i.e. life and death. And what is it that one of the teachers tells us in some of their letters, that it is because they understand the nature of the principles that they can maintain that life and that fire that keeps them together longer than the typical duration of human life in order to perform the task that they have to as relates to serving humanity. Our next slide brings us to another demonstration of fire, but interpreted from T. Subaru's 12 Signs of the Zodiac. And if you look at this and just think about what we went through and think of the fire that is always necessary, which we will see in a moment, as a key component to awaken the flame, the light, the heat, to generate the motion. In other words, to give active life and consciousness as reflected in that light to an entity or a monad in progression. We have number one, the first sign. He speaks of the self-existent or the eternal Brahman. And this brings us back to that one element with the hidden fire. The second is the pranava or the Om. And he speaks about the nature of that, which truly has to do with that great breath and the motion and the, you might say, divisions of time that Patanjali speaks about. The oscillations, the pulsations, and the vortical motions. You can get a great idea of what those fires are, once again, in Pistis Sophia, when they are talking about the higher elements and realms that exist and what they do or how one interacts with them, so to speak. The androgynous state, the Brahman, the bisexual state, clearly HPB speaks about that as being necessary. We have that reflected in the fires of our humanity, going through that bisexual state or that hermaphroditic state in terms of the root races. And the fire of mind that eventually becomes lit after that separation. The sacred tetragrammon, the four states. Again, if we think back just to the definition of the science of fire, that threefold trinity of oxygen and the fuel and the heat, and then that fourfold aspect of the reaction, we can see that that coincides again with the fire of the tetragram, both looking in and looking out. When it is looking out, we are creating that combustible fire and flame and light and manifestation. When it's looking in, it's looking at the three loci and the very source from which they arose. For in, for out, but it's still a pivotal fire. And we'll see the nature of that pivotal fire, hopefully in the chart in a minute. He goes on to speak about the five. We always put in 7 because these represent, instead of the 5 Brahmas in the Hindu, the 7 Dhyani Chohans, and they can be looked at individually, which is that individual wisdom that they represent, or collectively, i.e. in totality, the Jivatma. And that is, again, that central spiritual sun from another perspective and the fire that it represents and that actually sustains it as a subjectively visible object that now has achieved a state of active life. The astral light, the Holy Virgin, the 6 forces in nature, this is the summation or the synthesis of those 6 Saktis that he represents. And when these 6 Saktis from the Hindu side are broken down, they generate 36 tapams. And these have to do with the senses, and they have to do with the organs and the elements and the subtle elements and Prakriti and Purusha and the limiting factors and Mula Prakriti, as well as Shiva and Sakti and the inner states that exist. And yet, from a theosophical perspective, these would more properly be 49. But these 49 are simply at the level of creative manifestation, which is that post-generational phase as opposed to that pre-generational or pre-cosmic or pre-Brahmanic stage. Again, it's important to remember where we are when we're looking at what we're trying to understand. The next is the universe in thought. And this thought is related to the cognitive process. And then if we shoot down to the shape of the universe is the creative fires, those lower Prajapati putting the universe together, so to speak. Again, a lower aspect of 49 fires in terms of the lower angels of creation, of which there were 7, and their subdivisions and how they manifested on earth. Then the 14 lokas, and that should be a O, not a U, and subsequently the 5 elements. And those 5 elements would be the very gross elements. And throughout all of this, if we use the formula of fire, we should be able to understand how the hidden fire in the beginning becomes eventually manifest, and how its various motions according to the great breath generate these different principles of being. And if we start from that threefold logi that she spoke about and its divisions, that can see or help us see those 49 fires on the higher or inner plane that are then reflected on the Brahmanic plane, that are subsequently reflected in the cosmological and eventually in our own sidereal network. Now, these fires also, again, as we know, we don't have the time, but they relate to the root races, the lighting up of manas, and the different manus that were related and involved in that process. And so this quote from the SD, which many of you know, really points to that. The arhats of the fire mist of the 7th rung are but one remove from the root base of their hierarchy, the highest on earth and our terrestrial chain. This root base has a name which can only be translated by several compound words into English, the ever-living human Banyan. This wondrous being descended from a high region, they say, in the early part of the 3rd age, before the separation of the sexes of the 3rd race. And this is another aspect, again, that fire mist 7th rung represents a group of those kumaras that were affiliated and connected karmically with the job of lighting up manas, or giving us those manasic fires, not the comic fires. They were able to merge and link with those comic fires in order to allow intelligence of some sort to manifest on earth. But this then becomes the grid, and we'll probably, we're going to end after this. But in this grid, and this is just simply what HPB says, 7 principles: Atma, Buddhi, Manas, Kama, Prana, Astral, Physical, and each of them according to the 7 dhyanis. But again, the Atma of Atma, the Atma of Buddhi, the Manas of Atma, the Kama of Atma, the Prana of Atma, and then we would have the Atma of Buddhi moving down, or depending upon, again, which way you want to work this chart. If we're going Atma, Buddhi, Manas across the top, it would be the Atma of Buddhi, the Buddhi of Buddhi, the Manas of Buddhi, the Kama of Buddhi, the Prana of Buddhi, the Astral of Buddhi, etc. The interesting thing about this is that Kama is really at the center of all aspects of the 6 directions of this chart. If we go north, it's the central point. If we go south, it's the central point. If we go east, it's the central point. If we go west, it's the central. Northeast, northwest, southeast, southwest, it doesn't matter. And what this tells us is that, again, Kama, whether we call it desire, first arose in it at that 3rd stage of manifestation, or the fire of Kama that is hidden within the very one element that reflects the deity. It is all the same fire, modified to the principles through which it works, according to the planes upon which it works, and according to the volitional will that may or may not be directing it. And we didn't talk about the will aspect of it, but we definitely said enough. And so we'll end on this. And again, it just represents everything that we said. Again, from the SD, occultism sums up the one existence thus: deity is an arcane, living, or moving fire, And the eternal witnesses to this unseen presence are light, heat, moisture. This trinity including and being the cause of every phenomena, objectively or subjectively, in nature. And so hopefully we've just given a little bit of an idea of the role that fire plays in every aspect of our life that we take for granted and yet never see it working. Thank you.
Thank you, Gene. While people are gathering the courage to ask a question, I will ask one and buy people some time here. My question has to do with, I think it's on page 31 of the Voice of the Silence. I don't know if you have that near you. The lamp burns bright when wick and oil are clean. To make them clean, a cleaner is required. The flame feels not the process of the cleaning. And then it goes on to say that the branches of a tree are shaken by the wind, but the trunk remains unmoved. So there's this part, and you mentioned in your presentation about the flame, that's only kind of the externality or something, and it bears witness to something more cosmic, more universal, more invisible, probably more real.
Yes.
And that the flame itself is just like an aperture through which all that hidden reality comes through or something. Now, but fire is many times thought of in relation to transformation and regeneration, right? Complete transformation, whatever the combustion process is. It's the transformation, you just can't recognize it. You know, like wood, for example, turns into smoke and heat, for example. Mm-hmm. But it's still, the same essence is still there. So my question has to do with what's the relationship between this idea that there's something deeper to flame than flame, and the fact that when we undergo in our spiritual transformations, complete transformations, and yet there's something the same that's still left. Mm-hmm. Is there any relationship between these two realities, that there's something more to flame than flame, that you don't see, but it somehow is more real? That and the fact that in the transformative process, the externals you can't recognize, but the internals are still there.
Okay, so in a nutshell, I can't repeat that, but yeah, you know, is there something different or something more? And again, there's an expression that the fire and flame destroy the body of an arhat, and yet makes them immortal. And so if we go back and I just put it back up again to read, the flame, again, you have to remember, is 2 or 3 stages down and as a manifestation of something deeper that holds the potential and the power for that flame. And this quote reads, again, from the Parinirvana Sutra, the permanent never merges with the impermanent, although the two are one. So the permanence that we're trying to achieve in regards to, if we say it grossly, immortality consciously, is how do we graft our consciousness to that eternal basis, the permanent basis that never merges with the impermanent. And so that's the heart of the question. That is the clear equation of the Mahatma. And it goes on to say, even though the two are one, it is only when all outward appearances are gone, when the fire destroys everything that is not akin to its nature. And HPB gives us that piece of information because she tells us in one of her articles, only that which is Buddhic can be absorbed in Buddhi. Only that which is Atmic even though we think of that as a universal force, can be absorbed in the ground that gives rise to Atma. And so it is only when all outward appearances are gone that there is left that one principle of life, which exists, and this is beautiful, independently of all external phenomena, flame and external fire included. It is the fire that burns in the eternal light when the fuel is expended and the flame is extinguished. For that fire is neither in the flame nor in the fuel. And so that whole process again is a process whereby we find that fire that is similar in nature to that fire and add it in a conscious modality, which is why we cannot speak of anything on this earth achieving immortality as such, because it just gets burnt up in a good way and transformed back into its consciously pure element that can resonate with that flame. And so that's a whole different process than any that we're talking about in general. And so when the voice says to make them clean, a cleaner is required, the flame feels not the process of the cleaning, the body of the arhat that's being destroyed is not what they feel. Mm-hmm. They have died to that level of strata many times over, and yet can still hold it together because of the nature of fire if we use fire or force. HPB sometimes calls fire force, that they have learned to awaken in this process. So again, it takes us beyond the creative process, beyond the monastic process as such, beyond the Brahmanic process. Because as Subra Rao speaks about even the logi, those are things that we have to assimilate that are getting burnt up in the process as we return home, fully awake, so to speak. And that's that involution, evolution, 7 times 7 that that Theosophy suggests to us that we are trying to accomplish through general evolution. Some doing it faster. So hopefully that captures some of the question.
Great answer, yeah, to a kind of a loose question, but very helpful.
Thank you.
That part where you said about that even the flame itself is not the final product. I mean, right. And also what you said about that anything that isn't the fire is what gets transformed, right? At whatever level,
and at whatever, and that's the ascent. Mm-hmm. Because again, HPB tells us clearly about the physical fire, about the astral fire, about the etheric fire, about the Akashic fire, about the fire of Anima Mundi, about the Lagoic fires. And the Lagoic fires come before the Brahmanic fires and the monastic fires. And so we're really, really talking about a journey that is almost mind-blowing in trying to contemplate the vast scope of what it embraces. And yet with the teachings, it becomes again, kind of walk in the garden. Yes, Jeff.
Yeah, that was great. Both the question and answer were really helpful. So I want to ask just first of all, where's the quote of the Parinirvana Sutra? Was that in did HPB quote that?
Nah.
It was somewhere you found, huh?
Yes.
Okay.
It was quoted by one of the teachers. They pulled it out specifically to talk about some of these issues of that one essential element that is fire and yet is not fire because it gives rise to fire, air, water, ether, the highest intellection, literally, and the vitalizing force that then are equivalent to that one element.
So that was in the Mahatma letters, then, possibly.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it sounded like the Mahayana they're different Parinirvana sutras, so I just wanted to clarify that.
I figured you would.
Okay, that's my flame, not my fire. That's talking. And listening to you, like you described it as divine substance, fire as divine substance. It sure sounds like Daivi Prakriti to me. And your overall description, I think, would apply to Fohat. I mean, Fohat at all the different levels that HPB explicates it in The Secret Doctrine, because she does describe the pre-cosmic Fohat as being Eros, as in Hesiod saying that Eros was the beginning of everything. So, is that, so, okay, that was one observation.
I mean, I would always say that if we're going to kind of look at that, what comes before Fohat? Because when we begin to understand what comes before Fohat, we can begin to understand how the one element gives rise to Fohat. Because we have to explain that. I mean, if we start with Pralaya, nothing that we know is there. Everything is in a different state. And so what we really have to explain is the arisal of everything from that state.
Sure.
And so if we think of Fohat, we have to ask again, what level of application are we addressing? And then how did that arise and what was before?
Yeah, I mean, that would, sure, that would, I mean, I'm right now translating the Bhagavad Gita, Subbarao's notes on the Bhagavad Gita, and he says there's 4 principles,
Yeah, but he cheats. You have to excuse my expression. He cheats because even the Logi and the Devi Prakriti that he speaks about come after the element.
So the one element, meaning what, Parabrahm?
Again, it so much depends on where you begin, because even HPB begins with absoluteness before she begins with Parabrahm.
Okay, yeah.
And Parabrahm is part of a duality with Mula Prakriti.
Okay, yeah, maybe.
We typically, again, we don't think about that. We don't think about it as that. We speak about it as Parabrahm being that initial point of absoluteness, but she makes a distinction between absoluteness, absolute, and Parabrahm.
Okay, I'd have to go back to the SD and
yeah, it's in the earlier parts of the SD.
Yeah, okay. But I have one question, a little bit more. You speak of the frictional properties of fire, but friction is bodies rubbing against each other, right? So how does that enter? So would that going to the astrological model? Would that apply to like the third stage that corresponds to Gemini, where there's a duality and then a friction arising from that? Is that?
Well, I mean, there would be the friction that the unity can initiate within itself due to its own movement, self-generated. But then there is the friction once the androgynous state, as he said, the third stage, is accomplished, where you get the duality, and then you can have another level of friction there in terms of the cosmic. And then those forces, i.e. whether you call that Fohat and then the hardening of the atoms, coming down to the generation of the astrological aspects of the nebula, which is a different stage in the whole unfolding process. And that's why she says in the proem, there's the pralaya, then there's that state that she leaves up to intuition, then there's the emergence of the monads, then there is in stage 4, the differentiation of the germ. And in that aspect of separation and differentiation and differences, then you can get friction amongst particles. But the friction amongst particles that Fauhat hardened are different, obviously, than the friction that comes before that.
Sure. Oh, okay, thank you.
So we have different levels of everything, really, including friction, including Darby property. There's just it's all in context, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah, I guess what I was asking, I mean, fire is a unity in some sense, and how does friction arise from a unity?
Okay, and again, if we're going back to the Mahatmas themselves, they speak about the fact, and it's a very subtle challenge, that there is no difference between the element and the great breath.
Okay. Yeah. No.
And so when that great breath is whirling about amongst itself, that creates its own heat, but of such a superior level that we're still talking, if we want to talk science, pre-Big Bang.
Mm-hmm.
And that initial can generate logoic elements. And from those logoic elements, as Jonathan just said, step down Devi Prakriti, which then gives rise each one to its own light, its own rays, its own sevenfold differentiation, which is HPB saying the three logi themselves, each has its own 7 rays, and they have their subdivisions, and they interact, and yet the Laya post logo 1 opens up logo 2. And then Laya logo 3, if you want to look at it in protracted space and time. Or, as she says, each one 7, 3 logi, 21, with the centers, 24, the doubling because of the properties, 48, summated in that totality, 49, and in some respects, she says that can be the first logos. Now you can move on to the second, but again, now that's why it becomes important to try to understand what the nature of the substance is on that level, because the nature of the substance and the nature of the forces will have their own manifestation of the, as they, if we use the Hindu terms, the subtle elements. The subtle elements, the tamatras, HPB says in the footnote in Secret Doctrine, really represent the highest logi, 7. We typically don't even talk about it from that perspective. And so, again, it's really a journey.
Our time is up, technically. I would like to get to the 3 women who have burning questions.
Oh, Judy?
Oh, well, just very briefly, how can we connect the notion of fire to the Gospel of St. John, who says, I am the light that shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. I mean, it seems that without fire, we would not have consciousness, and there's nothing that can extinguish consciousness, even in the most abstract darkness. I can't imagine that anything could distinguish my consciousness or yours or anyone. So is this because consciousness itself comes from the divine Fauhat, which is, of course, an emanation of the first logos?
So would that be because the light shining in the dark, and whether the dark comprehends it or it's being extinguished or whatever, the light itself is the darkness. I mean, HPB says absolute light is absolute darkness. And it's only darkness as an appearance because she says we are ignorant as to its nature. But if, as you suggest, we reach that other side and we are one with it, nothing can ever extinguish it because we are the very nature of that which we seek. And so the piece of that we have to perhaps try to understand is how consciousness in regards to objectivity no longer exists, how consciousness in regards to subjectivity as relates to I no longer exists, how subjectivity and consciousness in relationship to the paradigms or the archetypes or the prototypes of all things in the mind of deity don't exist, and yet we still are. And there's a saying in the Bible, I think it was John or Paul, I don't know who said it, but I was there at the very beginning of the universe before the pillars of the universe were laid down. And to paraphrase that, it sounds very much like what you're saying, that whatever it is that we are is the true substratum of all existence and can never be extinguished if we can only awaken to it.
Bilbo?
Gene, that was mind-blowing, and I've got a lot to chew on. I want to go to the very first slide that you had, unless I was dreaming or hallucinating. You had something there that said, nothing of it is true. So,
Yes.
okay, so now I want to try to understand it. Is it something like talking about the unnameable and then erasing it because you can't talk about it?
Right. Yes.
Is that what you were trying to convey there, Eugene?
In a nutshell, yes. I mean, at the bottom of that walking in the imaginary garden of fire that, I just threw up as a title, it says, nothing we say today can be true.
Mm.
And it's true because only the realization of that reality can speak for itself. There are no words that can describe it. The paradoxes that we run into thinking in terms of duality, the paradoxes that we try to awaken in individuals to consider it from the perspective of unity are all just indicators of something tremendous that can only be realized when we rest in it, so to speak. So yeah, that's
Thank you.
the point.
Thank
You're
you. It was wonderful. Thank you, Eugene. Thank
You're
you.
welcome. Thank you.
That's where you get the last question.
Okay, let me put my face on here. Hi, Eugene.
Oh, hi. Hi there.
So brilliant. Oh my gosh. The fact that you had that chart up and then went right to the middle to comma,
Yeah.
did something to me. And I'm a very visual person, so I tend to catch on to things that are just sort of a picture.
Right.
And I thought of that Legoic heart coming out of the middle and just that fire, that compulsion. Who knows what that is? And then what is behind that compulsion? It is so, when we ask ourselves, why do we even ask ourselves why we say why? It's like, what is that? But the fact that you pointed it out and said that, let's look at comma right in the middle of this chart here.
Mm-hmm.
It's affecting everything, and it's coming from the heart of the chart, not from the right side, not from the left side. It's coming right from the middle, and it's affecting everything.
Right.
It demonstrates just how pervasive and permanent it is. And also, I wanted to get a little bit more on that 36 versus the 49 fires.
Mm-hmm.
So the 36, is that based on 6 times 6?
The 36 is based on basically, I think, the Shivistic view that there are 5 stages of internal awakening having to do with the Shiva state, the Shakti state, the state of will, knowledge, and action. And they call them Shiva, Sakti, Sadasiva, Ishvara, and Suravidya. And then there's Maya. And then there are the 5 limiting factors of Maya. We call that karma. And then once they are limited in terms of space, time, individuality, desire, creativity, and knowledge, they become a Purusha. That Purusha is related to Prakriti. And so now we're at a lower level. And this then is the true subjective level in that system. And now we're coming into the objective level, but that's still subjective in the typical system, because from Prakriti and Purusha, you get the Buddhic element, or Mahabhuti, as HPB says, and then you get the Ahamkaric, and then you get the mind. Then you get the 5 subtle elements, or we would say 7 subtle elements, or what they call the Tamatras. And from then, we get the 5 motor elements, the 5 sensory elements, the element of mind that incarnates, the 5 gross elements. And then if we really want to bring it up more, we talk about the 5 pranas, the Dhyana, Udana, Apana, Samana, and the prana. And how these vital forces then work with the lower gross elements and have a relationship to the higher elements, etc., etc. So when they do that, they've got their 36 as individual principles. But those are not the way that, as you know, theosophically, we view those principles. So there would be, from our perspective, once we look at that chart, 49. But again, as you just pointed out, if we have comma in the middle, that chart infolds itself into one principle.
And that's what kind of was getting at too, because even in the masters indicate that in all this old Sanskrit works, Vedic and Tantric, you find the number 6 mentioned more often than the number 7, because the 7 stands for the synthesis of each of those. So you're really, and what that 7 is might even be those logos points, I don't know, or maybe some prime number is, but
And yes, again, I mean, when she gives us those properties of light, the vibration, the electricity, the magnetism, the sound that comes out of there, the luminosity, all of those are forces and elements, states of consciousness, as well as aggregates of matter. And so, you know, they're really giving us keys to become true spiritual scientists in a way.
well, yeah, that's what we're doing. We're investigating. You're a brilliant man.
Oh gosh, thank you. Okay.
Does anyone have a final question or comment? Or Jean, would you like to say a final?
No, I mean, I you know, again, I mean, I just, you know, I mean, you could write several books on this. I never recognized before your assignment that fire was so universally pervasive in so many ways. And so, you know, it's been a learning experience for me in that regards as well. So thank you.
For all of us, yeah.
One of the things to simplify, and now I can see why that answer was given after listening to your talk. But I remember, I think I was around 18 when I asked an older student, what is fire? And he just looked at me and said, well, all you need is a match. I think you've just given us more of the match.
Yeah, it's quite a match, and yet it doesn't exist. How do you figure that out? Oh, but gosh, thank you all. Thank you. Thank you. It's been thank you for putting me to work, Jonathan.
Anytime. Okay, well, thank you very much, Jean. I'm just very, very grateful. A lot of us would have just probably burned up if we would have been given that assignment. So, but anyway, thank you very, very much.